Welcome back. In this lesson, I'm going to introduce Express, which is the framework that we're going to use throughout the rest of this course. There are three main questions that I want to answer here. The first one is, what is a framework? How is it different from a library? Then next is, what is Express? And then the last one is, why are we using Express? Why are we teaching Express in particular? Let's get going, and we'll start by talking about what a framework is. Up until this point, we've used a few libraries, including jQuery and Bootstrap, but also some people would refer to the CatMe and Knock Knock Jokes packages as libraries. Our definition so far of a library is that it's code that someone else wrote that we can include in our application and use. So that's also what frameworks are. Frameworks are code that someone else wrote, usually a lot of people wrote because it's a lot more code that we can use inside of our application, but the way that we use them is very different. So I have a great Stack Overflow post I'm going to pull up, and it talks about the difference between a framework and a library. And this first answer really nails it on the head. So I'll just read a few of the more important lines, including this first one. The most important difference, and in fact the defining difference between a library and a framework, is something called inversion of control. What does this mean? Well, it means that when you call a library, you're in control, but with a framework, the control is inverted. The framework calls you. And then I'll skip down to this section here. Basically, all the control flow is already in the framework, and there's just a bunch of predefined white spots that you can fill out with your own code. A library, on the other hand, is a collection of functionality that you can call. Those two excerpts do a great job of summarizing the differences. Both frameworks and libraries are external code that you're including in your own application, but a library is something that you're in control of. If you want to use the library, you can use one method, 10 methods. Just like if we include jQuery, it's up to us which parts of it we use. We might only use a few of the methods for animations, or we might use 100 different methods. With a framework, on the other hand, we give up a little bit of control. Where if we use a framework, like the one we're going to use, which is Express, we have some decisions that have been made for us that we have to abide by in order to use the framework. I like to think of it a little bit like Mad Libs, where a framework gives us the basic scaffolding, and then we fill in the blanks with the important parts. But I want to make it really clear, the point of a framework is not to erase any sort of creativity or homogenize the way that all applications work. What frameworks really do is they take all of the common stuff that we do in every application, all of the setup work, all the basic things that every app needs, and it just pre-packages it all up so that we can use it and get started on new apps without having to do all the basic groundwork every single time. So when we write an application, we just focus on the important content of the application, what makes it unique, rather than spending time working on the very, very basic stuff every single time we make a new application. So as I mentioned, Express is what we're going to use. Express is a framework, and in particular, it's a web development framework. There are all sorts of different frameworks out there. There are frameworks that help you make video games. There are frameworks that help you make mobile apps. And there are tons and tons of frameworks to make web applications. Express is one of those. Other frameworks that exist across all languages include things like Flask for Python, Django for Python, Rails for Ruby, Sinatra for Ruby, and there are even other Node web development frameworks like Sails.js, which is another relatively popular one. But Express is the one that we're going to use. And let me just show you, before we talk about why we're using it, let me go over to an application I have created. This is another Cloud9 instance I have running, and this is an Express app. So all of this right here, all of these files and directories are all part of an Express application. And by using Express, I was able to focus on just writing the application code, not having to focus on all the basic legwork of creating a server and dealing with routes and connecting to a database and all the basic steps that every app requires. Instead, I just focused on the application content. Shortly, we'll be creating our own apps that look like this, where we have 20, 30 different files and 10 or 15 different directories, all sorts of different packages that we're installing and including. There will be tons of moving pieces, but Express is the glue that keeps everything together. What I'm saying will make a lot more sense once you actually start writing apps in the next video and you see what Express actually does for you. So the one other thing that I want to talk about is, why are we using Express? I said there are a lot of different frameworks. Why are we going with Express? My answer is very similar to the answer I gave as far as why we're learning Node, why we're using JavaScript on the back end instead of Ruby or Python or PHP, in that there's a few reasons. The first reason is that Express is by far, without a doubt, the most popular Node web development framework. It has the most downloads on NPM. It has the most people contributing to it on GitHub. It's just the most widely used Node framework, which is always a great reason for us to use it, not just because it's trendy, not just because people say that it's good, but more so because there's lots of tutorials and there's a big community of people who know Express and who are writing about it and talking about it, which is always something you want to look for when you're learning a new technology. And the second reason that we're using Express is a little more complex to explain. I need to give you a little bit of backstory on the different types of frameworks that we can have. There are two terms that people will use to describe frameworks. Those are heavy and light, or heavyweight and lightweight. Heavyweight and lightweight refer to how much a framework does for you versus how much you have to do yourself. So think of it, if we're talking about Mad Libs again, a framework that's heavyweight really has a lot of text in there and just a few blanks that you fill in. A framework that's lightweight has a lot more blanks, a lot more frequently across the page, where you're expected to go in and fill in your own code more often. So where Express fits into all of this is that it's a very lightweight framework. So it doesn't hide things from you. It doesn't do things you don't expect it to do. You use Express and you know exactly what you're getting. Versus a framework like Rails, which I love Rails, by the way, I'm not trashing it, but when you teach people Rails, it's really problematic because it does so much for them and you can make apps fast, but students don't understand what it's doing because they've never seen a framework that doesn't do that for them. So I've noticed that students who learn with a framework like Rails as their very first framework, a very heavyweight framework where they only fill in a few blanks, they end up being very reliant on Rails. And they don't understand the underlying concepts, and they can't work with a framework that isn't Rails. Or at least it takes more effort for them to unlearn the Rails way of doing things. So Express, on the other hand, is much lighter weight, and that doesn't mean that it's less powerful or that you can't use Express to do things that you can do in Rails. It just means that you need to understand how things work in order to get things done. In Rails, you can make an awesome web app without really knowing what the heck you're doing. So in my mind, that's really the main reason that I'm teaching Express. Yes, it's popular and there's a large community behind it, but more importantly, it's just a great tool to learn how to make web apps with. The last thing I'll do here is show you the official Express homepage. The first thing that you might notice is this little blurb here that Express is a fast, unopinionated, minimalist web framework for Node.js. And this word unopinionated, when it's referring to a framework, what that means is that it's flexible. It lets you do things in the way that you want. Versus Rails, if you use Rails, it's extremely opinionated. You have to make files named a very particular way. They have to go in a very particular place. With Express, we have more freedom to decide how we're going to structure things. You can also see that we install it just like any other package, npm install express. We'll learn what the -- save means in the next video. And to finish up on here, I highly recommend you check out the Getting Started guide if you have any questions. And there's some other great resources on here as well, including their official guide, the API reference, some advanced topics that we'll talk about at the end of the course, and a great list of resources, including books and blogs, some great tutorials, and a glossary that we'll come back to later in the course as well. All right, so let's wrap this up. What is a framework? How is it different from a library? Framework is just a bunch of code that someone else has written, just like a library is, except when we use a framework, we have less control. And the goal of using one is to make our development of whatever it is, a game, a web app, a mobile application, we want to make things faster, so we use a framework. Express is one framework for web development, and it happens to be a Node framework. There are other web development frameworks out there, but we're using Express, and we're using it because it's popular. Lots and lots of people use it. There's great documentation and tutorials. It's widely used and supported, but also, and even more importantly, it's a great first framework for someone to learn. All right, in the next video, we're going to install Express and make our first simple application.